Hey guys, we are going to finish up our little slideshow PowerPoint on the 13 colonies by finishing up a couple of the jobs that they have. Somewhere in here I will sneaky hide your assignment, so make sure you watch the whole thing all the way through and we can get started. Last thing we talked about was being a blacksmith. We're going to talk today about being a silversmith. Silver was mostly imported from England during the colonial times. It was a luxury to have silver then, as most people could not afford it. Each house had their own silversmith to make smaller household items such as shoe buckles, spoons, and buttons. They also repaired silver items for wealthy families. Like a blacksmith, a silversmith heated the silver using a forge. Then he would pour the hot liquid silver into a cast iron mold to shape it. A silversmith used small hammers and an anvil to pound out the silver. Solder was used to join pieces together. Some pieces were engraved, which took a very steady hand. Finally, a pumice stone was used to polish the silver pieces so they sparkled. Paul Revere was a silversmith. He started his apprenticeship under his father, who was a goldsmith and silversmith. His father died when he was just 19 years old, so Paul took over running the family silversmith shop. He trained a large number of apprentices and journeymen in his shop, including his own son. During the American Revolution, Paul Revere became active in government, so his son took over the family business. Printer. Printers provided the colonists with important news. Many printers started their apprenticeship as a young boy. They lived with a master printer to learn his trade for 10 years. During his training, he would learn how to work a printing press. Blocks contained one letter of the alphabet. Okay, I'm already sneaking in your assignment right here. I want you to imagine that you were a printer back when the 13 colonies were founded, and you had to, or I'm sorry, not that you were a printer, that you were looking for an apprenticeship back in when the 13 colonies were founded. And if you knew that you had to do this apprenticeship for 10 years, which of the jobs so far would you think that you could be okay with doing for 10 years? If none of them sound appealing, just wait. There'll be a couple more, and maybe one of those would sound the most appealing. But for your assignment, I want you to respond to this and write in 3 sentences, complete sentences at least. If you want to write more, great. If not, fine. 3 complete sentences telling me which one of these jobs you would be okay with having if you had to have it for 10 years and why. What about that job makes it an okay job to have for 10 years? So that's your assignment today, and we'll continue on with the rest of our slideshow. So each letter of all the words on a page had to be positioned in just the right spot and set in backwards. That way, when the page was pressed, it came out printed correctly. The black letters were then dabbed with black ink. Next, a sheet of paper was placed on top of the letters. Finally, it was pressed down by hand. When the page was lifted, it revealed the articles for readers. It took up to 25 hours to print one newspaper sheet during that time. So imagine you wrote your name on a piece of paper and then you hold it in the mirror, kind of like how that turns out backwards. They would have to make their writing backwards so that when they looked at it in the mirror or printed it on the page, it would come out the right way. Town criers. Sounds like a sad job. Town criers brought the news to the colonists' doorstep like a live newscast long before newspapers and printed materials were created. Sometimes they were a husband and a wife team, with the wife ringing the bell and the husband shouting out the news of the day. They had to be able to read the official statements written in fancy cursive. Town criers were protected under the law. You may have heard the saying, "Don't shoot the messenger," which came about from this important trade during the colonial times. Basically, what that phrase means is that if someone brings you bad news, but it's not necessarily their fault or something that they did, the phrase "don't shoot the messenger" means don't be upset with that person. They're just the ones who have to deliver the news to you. They're not the ones who made that unfortunate situation or made things bad for you. I'm honestly not sure if this is Coopers or Coppers, but it looks like Cooper's name, so we're going to go for it. Coopers. Coopers, or barrel makers, were very important during the colonial times. Barrels were used to store everything and anything you can think of during the colonial times, including salted meats, grains, tobacco, flour, and gunpowder. These containers were created by coopers and made from wood. It took an apprentice years to learn how to make all the different sized and shaped barrels to perfection. Wig makers. Wigs were popular with the successful businessmen in the colonies. Wearing a wig showed others that you were wealthy. A wig maker made wigs from horse, goat, or human hair. Mostly upper-class men wore wigs weaved into the latest fashions. Some women wore wigs, but most had their own hair styled with flowers or bows. Cabinet makers. Cabinet makers made more than just cabinets. They became masters at creating all kinds of furniture, including tables, chairs, and desks. People living in the colonies needed all kinds of furniture, so cabinet makers were in great demand. After their apprenticeship was completed, they made a good living. Brick makers. Brick makers dug the clay from the wet ground. Then they shaped it into a rectangular shape. When it dried out, it was placed in a bed of sand to completely dry, which took several weeks. Bricks were then baked or fired in a hot kiln for days. Many brick makers moved to the area where the brick buyers lived to make the bricks on location. So they would travel around to wherever bricks were needed and work there rather than having to transport the bricks to where they were needed. Merchants. Merchants were the businessmen who bought and sold goods in the market towns. They arranged the buying and selling of goods between overseas suppliers and the local farmers and shopkeepers in the colonies. Merchants played an important role in the colonies because without them, there was no one to supply the colonists with all the supplies they needed. And technology in the colonies. So those were all the jobs and things you could have had in the colonies. So for your assignment, you need to pick one of those and tell me what about that job makes it appealing to you to have for 10 years. Okay? The plow was first invented thousands of years ago during ancient times. But during colonial times, the plow was greatly improved by adding an iron shovel on the end. This shovel plow dug a shallow furrow or trench in the ground. These walking plows were small enough to be pulled by just one animal, usually an ox. Horses and mules were sometimes also used. Using the plow helped farmers produce more crops, and it was a lot easier than doing it all by hand. If they're digging holes and things to plant crops in, and they are planting hundreds of crops, they don't want to have to dig hundreds of holes, so something like a shovel plow would make it a lot easier for them to do. New England colonists became expert shipbuilders. With thick forests and trees all around, they quickly learned how to process the lumber in sawmills for building houses and ships. It wasn't long before shipbuilders began building a new large vessel each year. Ships were needed for fishing and whaling. The most important shipyards were in big cities that sat right on the water, like Boston. And that is the entirety of our slideshow. So go ahead and go respond to the